Donc, nous avons le plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir Seth Holmes, qui est anthropologue à l'université de Berkeley en Californie, qui est en ce moment en séjour de recherche à Marseille. Donc Camille Lance-Levé, Alice Servier et moi-même Rémi Sainton, qui avons organisé la conférence. Nous remercions pour leur soutien le laboratoire DINAM, le laboratoire SAGE, la faculté des sciences sociales, l'Institut de sociologie et l'Institut d'ethnologie. Alors, Seth Holmes est docteur en anthropologie et docteur en médecine, et vous allez entendre comment il a su tirer profit de cette double formation lors d'une étude ethnographique de migrants mexicains venus travailler illégalement pour la plupart dans une ferme au nord-ouest des États-Unis. Dans son livre qui est paru en 2013 intitulé Fresh Fruits, Broken Bodies, Seth montre à merveille, entre autres, les processus par lesquels les problèmes de santé qui tiennent au travail très dur de ces migrants sont invisibilisés, déniés, naturalisés. Et c'est ce dont il va nous parler aujourd'hui. Alors, avant de laisser la parole à Seth, je vous enjoins à laisser vos micros éteints, sauf si au moment de la discussion, vous voulez poser une question. Nous sommes quelques personnes à être dans la salle. Si une personne de la salle veut poser une question, il faudra qu'elle vienne au micro de Seth, ou que je répète la question. Et la conférence se fera en anglais. Vous pourrez poser lors de la discussion vos questions en français, et je les traduirai à Seth. Voilà, donc Seth Holmes, c'est à vous. Je vous laisse la parole. Merci.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be at the University of Strasbourg. And it's interesting to be in the middle of snow yesterday, coming up from Marseille where it's already warm and springtime. And it's also interesting to find out more about the different linkages between the social sciences here and the School of Medicine, anthropology, and sociology. So, how do I move the slides forward?
Right.
The arrow?
You have to click on the. You have to be on, on the program, so you go on
I
the
see.
program, and then
Okay. Like this? It moves it on mine, but not there.
you have to click on it, you know. You have to click on it,
Yeah.
and then, no? Yes, now it works.
Ah, interesting.
And you see the...
Yeah. Okay. So today, sorry about that. I'll be talking from the book Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. I'll be talking some about my research with immigrant farm workers and the doctors and nurses who work with them. And I'm happy to answer questions afterwards related to this project and other projects. Some of the slides will be blank because I'm talking about something that I want us all to focus on a great deal. And also I should explain that as a medical doctor, I've been trained to give PowerPoint presentations, which sometimes in the audience I find to be a little bit boring. And as an anthropologist at Berkeley, I'm trained to read a paper to you, which also sometimes in the audience I find to be a little bit boring. So today I'm going to do both. I'll do my best to keep it interesting. So there are two primary questions that animate my research. First, how do social structures, social inequalities, and social hierarchies produce health, well-being, injury, and disease for different categories of people? And in this project specifically, how are indigenous Mexican migrants positioned by categories of race, class, and citizenship through their migration circuits, and how does this positioning produce health, illness, and suffering? The second question is, how do social hierarchies and socially structured sickness come to be understood as normal and natural both in society and in medicine? And when are they confronted or resisted? And in this project specifically, how do representations in society as well as in the clinic serve to make invisible or legitimate the predicaments and illnesses of indigenous Mexican farm workers? So I'll spend the first section of the talk setting the scene, mapping the social positions in farming in the United States, and then I'll move on to analyzing and theorizing these two problems about social inequalities and health inequalities. In the United States, the National Agricultural Workers Survey indicates that 81% of farm employees are immigrants, 95% of whom are from Mexico, and over half of whom are undocumented. It's estimated that there are 1 million indigenous Oaxacans in the United States, primarily Mixtec, Zapotec, and Triqui people, who speak their indigenous language before they learn Spanish. Transnational migration is particularly compelling in the last year, as borders have been closed and reinvigorated even within the Schengen area, as many societies, including European societies, have found that they don't have the migrant laborers and food systems that they have come to rely on, as different countries, including Germany and Norway, have chartered special planes from different countries to bring workers in across otherwise restricted borders, and countries including France and the UK have started programs to try to convince young citizens to work on farms since there aren't enough migrant workers. In terms of health, Mexican migrant farm workers have very poor outcomes. Specifically, agricultural workers have an occupational death rate 5 times higher than the national average, and migrant and seasonal farm workers have increased rates of many conditions, including HIV, TB, heat stroke, malnutrition, liver and kidney disease. But despite this poor health status, in the United States, migrant farm workers have very poor access to health care. It's estimated that only 5% have any form of health insurance. And despite the occupational injury rate, farm workers are excluded from workers' compensation benefits, including health care in most states. And finally, indigenous Mexican migrants have significantly lower rates of health insurance and access to health care than their mestizo Mexican counterparts. This transnational project involved spending a year and a half living and working with indigenous Mexican migrant farm workers. The fieldwork began in rural Washington state near Canada and involved 5 months living in a migrant labor camp, picking strawberries twice a week, accompanying migrant workers to clinics, hospitals, and social service institutions, and interviewing farm employees and the doctors and nurses who work with them. I then accompanied several indigenous Triqui families from Oaxaca, Mexico, as they migrated and spent 3 months in Central California, living first homeless out of our cars, and then in a 3-bedroom apartment with 19 people, looking for work and occasionally pruning vineyards. And again, I accompanied migrant laborers to clinics and interviewed them, the farm contractors, and the doctors and nurses who worked with them. Next, I spent 4 months in the Triqui home village of San Miguel in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, in a partially constructed house of one of the families I had worked with in Washington and California. I helped in the house construction, harvested and planted corn, and observed interactions in the village's small federal clinic. In April of that year, I accompanied 10 young men from this village as they ventured to a border town, made contact with a border crossing guide, and crossed the border by foot into Arizona, were apprehended by the Border Patrol and put in Border Patrol jail. After my companions were deported back to Mexico and I was released from jail, I interviewed Border Patrol officers, border activists, and civilian vigilantes in Arizona before returning to Central California to meet up with my Triqui companions who had recrossed the border. And then I worked with them again in another berry picking season in Washington state. And over the last years, I've returned to each of these sites several times. So the rest of the talk will take place in the Skagit Valley of Washington state, halfway between Seattle, Washington, and Vancouver, Canada. The Tanaka Farm is the largest farm in the Skagit Valley, employing 500 people in the peak of the picking season, June through October. Also, if I'm speaking too quickly with my American accent, will you tell me? Or try to tell me? The farm advertises itself as, quote, a family business spanning 4 generations with over 85 years experience in the small fruit industry. And on a practical level, all the employees on the farm grow, harvest, process, and sell berries, supporting the explicit goals of the company. On another level, the structure of farm work inheres a subtle and complex hierarchy. The structure of labor is both determined by inequities in society at large, specifically those organized around race, citizenship, class, and gender, and it reinforces those larger inequities. The structure of farm labor includes several hundred workers occupying many positions from owner to receptionist, field manager to tractor driver, and berry checker to berry picker. Anxieties, privileges, and health differ from the top to the bottom of this labor organization. And so I'll now quickly run through this social structure in U.S. farming. The 3rd generation of Japanese-American Tanaka brothers makes up the majority of executives on the farm. The others are Anglo-American professionals recruited from other businesses. The executives work seated behind desks in private offices and live in their own houses, many with panoramic views of the valley. They work long hours, usually starting before the sun comes up. They often take time off during the day to work out in the local gym or to meet a friend for lunch. They worry about farm survival in a landscape of competition and economic globalization. The crop managers have private offices in a small field house several miles into the fields from the main farm office, though they spend significant time walking and overseeing what goes on in the fields. They work similar hours to the executives and have somewhat less choice in when they take breaks. They're all Anglo-Americans and live in private houses in one of the nearby towns. The administrative assistants work seated at desks in common spaces and live in relatively simple family houses near the farm. They're almost entirely white, with a few U.S. citizen Latinas from Texas. The teenage checkers, who are local Anglo high school students, weigh the berries and spend a lot of their time waiting. Both the administrative assistants and the teenage checkers worry primarily about the moods and reactions of their supervisors. The other workers live in one of the labor camps. The first holds 50 people and is located 100 feet from the road. Each shack has heating and insulation, and the field supervisors who walk outside directing and observing the field pickers live here. Some treat their workers with respect, while others use outright racist epithets. They're bilingual in Spanish and English, almost entirely Latino U.S. citizens from Texas, along with one Mixtec indigenous man from the Mexican state of Oaxaca. The other camp, located several miles away from the farm headquarters, holds 250 people. The shacks here look the same but have no heating and no insulation, and this is where the majority of the farm's laborers, the strawberry pickers, who are paid per pound, live. They're made up almost entirely of undocumented Triqui indigenous Mexicans. Marcelina, a 28-year-old Triqui picker, explained, "It's very difficult for a person here. I came to make money, like I thought here on the other side of the border there's money. But no. Sometimes the checkers steal pounds. Sometimes rotten berries make it into the bucket. Eat that one, they say, throwing it into your face. They don't work well. This is not good. There in Oaxaca we don't have work. There are no jobs there. Only the men work sometimes. But since there are many children in my family, the men don't make money for me and my son. And that's why I wanted to come here to make money. But no." In many ways, ethnicity, education, citizenship, I didn't take the appropriate position in the labor hierarchy. For the purposes of my fieldwork, I positioned myself in the housing and occupations of the Triqui undocumented immigrants. I picked strawberries twice a week and gained bodily data, including knee, back, and hip pain. And I often felt sick to my stomach the night before picking due to the stress about reaching the minimum weight. But because of my social and cultural capital, the farm executives treated me as someone who was out of place, and they gave me special permission to keep my job and my labor camp shack, even though I was actually never able to pick the minimum weight. crop managers, and supervisors treated me as a sort of jester, as respected entertainment. They often joked with me using rhetorical questions like, "Are you still glad you chose to pick?" And sometimes they would pick into my bucket to keep me from falling too far behind. On the other hand, the other pickers interacted with me with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Many wondered why there was a gabacho chacan, which is a mixture of Spanish and triqui that means bald-headed white American, who was picking berries with them. Several believed I was a spy for the police or the Border Patrol or the U.S. government, and others thought that I might be a drug smuggler who was hiding out from the police or the Border Patrol or the U.S. government. During dinner one evening in his labor camp shack, Samuel, who's standing up in the picture with a Nets hat on, complained to me about the problems that lack of resources created in his hometown and said that they need a strong mayor, a strong presidente, and I asked if he would be mayor someday. Clearly analyzing social hierarchy, he replied, "No, you need to have education and money and ideas. You'll be presidente of San Miguel, Seth, and you can do a lot of good. We need a water pump and paved roads." Near the end of my research, Samuel told me, "Right now, we and you are the same. We're poor. But later, you'll be rich and live in a luxury house, a casa de lujo." And I explained that I didn't want a luxury house, but rather a simple house, and I was honestly thinking about a craftsman-style house in Seattle or Berkeley, where I had gone to school. And Samuel clarified his social analysis. "But you'll have a bathroom on the inside, right?" The ethnicity and citizenship hierarchy not only produces the labor and housing pecking order that we just described, but this whole complex maps onto the health inequities that I outlined at the beginning of the talk. The Triqui people inhabit the bottom rung of the hierarchy in the Skagit Valley, with the most stressful, humiliating, and physically strenuous jobs, with the most exposure to weather and pesticides. They live in the coldest, wettest shacks in the most hidden labor camp. In a recent essay, literary scholar Lauren Berlant develops a theory that she calls slow death. She explores temporality, suffering, and agency within contemporary forms of capitalism, and she defines slow death as, quote, "the physical wearing out of a population or deterioration of people in that population that is very nearly a defining condition of their experience and historical existence." Berlant describes the ordinary and taken for granted attrition or decrease in life agency in the context of capitalist exploitation, and she argues that slow death is, quote, "not memorable and not capable of causing meaningful change because it's experienced as what she calls crisis ordinariness, as a defining characteristic of normal life for particular classes of people." It could be argued that indigenous Mexican farm workers experience an everyday ongoing life that's similar to this slow death described by Berlant. Migrant farm workers have myriad health problems due to the conditions in which they live and work, including chronic pesticide and heat exposure, repeated carrying of heavy loads, regular work with dangerous machinery, and harvesting while bent over or kneeling. But it could be equally fair to mention that the chronic conditions causing migrant farm worker injury include the re-regulation of the state in support of the market. For example, in the United States, the North American Free Trade Agreement that disallows relatively poor countries like Mexico from protecting their citizens with tariffs or taxes, while allowing wealthy countries to protect their products with inverse tariffs or taxes known as subsidies, as well as things like structural racism and anti-immigrant prejudice that effectively bar certain classes of people from most jobs and funnel undocumented Mexican immigrants into some of the most dangerous and unhealthy positions in society. I think you should be able to think of some examples within Europe that are similar. Farm work, in many ways, is defined by the temporality and spatiality of slow death. Strawberry pickers on the farm in Washington state are required to bring in a minimum of 50 pounds of de-leafed strawberries every hour. Otherwise, they're fired and kicked out of the labor camp. In order to meet these requirements, they take few or no breaks from before sunrise until the afternoon when that field is completed. Many don't eat or drink anything before work, so they don't have to take time to use the porta potty, the toilet. They work as hard and fast as they can, picking bent over at the waist 7 days a week, without a day off until the last strawberry is processed. And they leave their families and homelands to hike through a dangerous desert in order to survive. Yet these times and spaces of slow death are largely invisible as politicians ignore immigrant workers in the midst of ongoing debates related to health reform. But because of the contemporary categories of Mexican, migrant, and farm worker, the chronic wearing out due to these labor and living conditions at many times is deemed normal for, or even essential to those persons positioned in these categories. For Mexican migrant farm workers, in some ways, death is happening over time, over space. After my first week on the farm, one young female picker told me that she could no longer feel anything in her body at all. Another said that her knees, back, and hips are always hurting. One of the young men I saw playing basketball before the harvest started told me that he and his friends could no longer play because their bodies hurt too much. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who lived near me in the labor camp, explained, "You pick with both hands at once, bent over, kneeling like this," and he demonstrated kneeling all the way down. "Your back hurts, you get knee pains, and pain here," and he touched his hip. "When it rains, you get mad, but you have to keep picking. They don't give lunch breaks. You have to work every day like that to make anything. You suffer a lot in work." During my research, some of my family and friends came to visit me, and most of them blamed the farm executives for the living and working conditions of berry pickers. They assumed that it was the growers' fault that the pickers live in such poor conditions and that the growers could easily rectify the situation. This is an aerial view of the Skagit Valley leading up to the time of my research that demonstrates a few things. First, expanding urban boundaries. You can see the black and white towns growing, and then you can also see hints of the smaller family farms being bought up and consolidated into more and more corporate farms. The hierarchy on the farm, in many ways, is not entirely conscious or chosen on the part of the farm owners as individuals. Rather, the inequalities are driven by structural violence, as well as the anxieties it produces. The stark market competition and the precarious future of the farm squeeze growers such that they worry primarily about the potential bankruptcy of the farm, as well as their family's own quality of life. The structural nature of the labor hierarchy comes into relief when the hopes and values of the growers are considered. The Tanaka farm executives are ethical people who have a vision of a good society that includes family farming. They want to treat their workers well and leave a legacy for their children. Several of them asked my opinion on how the labor camps could be improved. And perhaps instead of blaming the growers only as individuals, it might be more appropriate to understand them as human beings trying to lead ethical yet comfortable lives in the midst of a particular social, political, and economic system in which we all play a part. So now that we've considered the ethnicity-citizenship hierarchy and the ways in which it produces illness and injury on the farm, I'd like to move on to consider migrant health and healthcare. First, I'll talk about the migrant clinic in general before moving on to the illness narratives and experiences of 2 migrant laborers and their interactions with health professionals. Medical professionals in the field of migrant health work under difficult circumstances with unreliable sources of funding. They often feel hopeless as they watch the health of their migrant patients decline. Dr. Samuelson, a physician in the migrant clinic in the Skagit Valley, explained, "I see an awful lot of people just wearing out, 40-something or late 30s or early 50s. They're just worn out. They've been used and abused and worked physically harder than anybody should be expected to work for that number of years. Then they come out with this nagging back pain. You work it up and it's not getting better and you don't think they're cheating. It gets to the point where you just have to give them an MRI scan and their back is toast. In their early 40s, they have the arthritis of a 70-year-old and they're not getting better. They're told, sorry, go back to what you're doing, and they're stuck. They're screwed, in a word, and it's tragic, unquote. At the same time that most health professionals in this field feel overworked and feel powerless to change the structural forces causing health problems for their patients, many of them voiced a commitment to work with this population. Many of them explained to me a feeling that Mexican migrant farm workers deserved top-quality health care, and most felt a sense of calling to care for this population. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who lived near me in the labor camp, experienced acute pain in his right knee when he pivoted from one row to the other while picking strawberries. After continuing his work in vain hopes that the pain would go away, he asked his supervisor about the incident, and the boss said simply, okay, and drove away. Unsure of what to do, Abelino kept picking in great pain. 2 days later, work was abruptly canceled, and Abelino and I went into an urgent care clinic. He ended up seeing 4 doctors and a physical therapist, usually without a translator in Spanish and much less in Triqui. In the intervening months, he limped around camp, taking care of his kids while his wife picked in the fields. The urgent care doctor explained that Abelino should not work. He should rest and let his knee recover. The occupational health doctor we saw the following week said Abelino could work provided he didn't bend, walk, or stand. Abelino went to the farm office to ask for lighter work of this sort, and the bilingual receptionist told him, in a frustrated tone, no, porque no, and wouldn't let him talk with anyone else. After a few weeks, the occupational health doctor passed Abelino's care to a busy rehabilitation medicine specialist, who told Abelino and me that he must work hard picking strawberries in order to make his knee better. She asked me to translate that he had been picking incorrectly and hurt his knee because he didn't know how to bend over. But notably in her rush, she had never asked Abelino any details about his work, including how he bent over. And years later, Abelino still tells me that he occasionally has knee pains and that, quote, los médicos no saben nada, doctors don't know anything. For me, as a medical doctor, that was a troubling thing to hear, although given his experience, it made sense. Crescencio, another tricky man living near my labor camp shack, approached me after picking one day and asked if I had any medicine for headaches. He explained that every time a supervisor calls him names on the job, makes fun of him, or reprimands him unfairly, he gets an excruciating headache in the center of his head. He told me that the headaches make him prone to anger with his wife and children, and that he did not ever want to become violent with his family and wanted help for his headache before that could happen. He'd seen a few physicians about this in Mexico and the US, as well as a traditional Triqui healer, but nothing had helped. The only thing that made his headache go away was drinking 20 to 24 beers, and then he would wake up without a headache. He had used this remedy a few times in a given week, and I suggested he go into the local migrant clinic to see if there was something else they could try. A week later, he told me that he'd seen one of the doctors, but that, quote, they didn't know anything. Later, I interviewed this doctor about the interaction. She was trained in one of the best medical schools in the US and chose to work in this clinic because she wanted to work with this marginalized population. She was smart, idealistic, and hardworking in the midst of a busy, understaffed, and underfunded clinic. And after looking at her notes in his medical chart, she explained, well, yes, he thinks that he's the victim and thinks that the alcohol or the headache makes him beat his wife, but really he's the perpetrator and everyone else is the victim. Until he owns his problem, he can't really change. Nothing really works, none of these migraine medicines or anything. But you have to put people in jail because then they see a show of force. That's the only thing that works, because then they have to own the problem as theirs and they start to change. He came to see me once and I told him to come back 2 weeks later after not drinking, but he didn't come back 2 weeks later. Instead, he came back a month later. It looks like he told the doc he saw that time something about when people at work tell him what to do, it makes him mad, and that's what gives him a headache. He needs to learn how to deal with authority. We referred him to therapy. Do you know if he's going to therapy? Despite this physician's idealism and good intentions, her difficult, busy job and the lenses she received in her education did not allow her to see the social context of the sickness of her patients. In his book, The Birth of the Clinic, Michel Foucault describes the theory of the clinical gaze. He explains that there was a change in medicine around the time of the advent of cadaveric dissection or anatomy lab. Whereas physicians used to focus on the words of the patient, the symptoms as expressed by the patient, they began instead to focus on the diseased organs, treating the patient more as a series of objects that make up a body. In Foucault's description, the primary question changed from, quote, what is wrong, to, quote, where does it hurt? This change in many ways was necessary for the birth of science and contemporary forms of health knowledge. But as would be expected within this paradigm, the rehabilitation medicine physician and the migrant health doctor who I described earlier saw the tricky bodies in their offices, yet were unable to engage the human and social context that led to their sickness. Thus, in some ways, it was unavoidable that they would utilize a narrow lens that decontextualizes sickness, transporting it from the realm of inequalities and power to the realm of the individual body. Yet since the time of Foucault, the paradigm of biopsychosocial health has been taken up by medicine. Beyond the acontextual gaze theorized by Foucault, physicians in many parts of the world today are also taught to see behavioral factors in health, such as exercise, diet, and substance use. Behavioral health education has been added as part of the laudable move to broaden health education. However, without being trained to consider the social structures that shape the suffering of their patients, health professionals are equipped to see primarily biological and behavioral determinants of sickness. Thus, well-meaning clinicians are limited to blaming the sickness on the patient. For example, the assumed incorrect bending while picking, or the supposed trouble with authority, without appreciating the hierarchies that position their patients in particular risk in the first place. Ironically, the progressive move to include behavioral health in medical education without the correlate inclusion of social analysis may be exactly that which leads clinicians to individualize risk and responsibility, inadvertently blaming the recipients of socially structured injury. So how has this order of inequalities become unchallenged and unquestioned? How has it come to be understood as normal and natural? Pierre Bourdieu explains a theory of symbolic violence as the naturalization, including internalization, of social inequalities. He explains that we perceive the social world through, quote, historically accreted schemata of perception. In other words, lenses through which we perceive the world that we gain over time. These cognitive lenses, schema, reflect the social structures to which we've become accustomed. Thus, we misrecognize the social order as natural because that which we perceive matches the lenses through which we perceive it. The inequalities comprising the social world are thus made invisible, taken for granted, or normal. When I asked a mestiza Mexican social worker why tricky people have only berry-picking jobs, she explained, "A los oaxaqueños les gusta trabajar agachados." Oaxacans like to work bent over. Whereas she told me mestizo Mexicans, called simply Mexicanos, get too many pains if they work in the fields. Later, I asked the farm's apple crop manager why I hadn't seen any tricky people harvesting apples, the field job with the highest pay. And he explained, Oaxacans are too short to reach the apples. They're too slow. They have to use ladders a lot more than some of the other guys, and besides, they don't like ladders anyway. He continued that Oaxacans are perfect for picking berries, quote, because they're lower to the ground, unquote. These perceptions of ethnic body difference serve as the lenses through which symbolic violence is enacted. In this way, each category of body is understood to deserve its relative social position. Because of what's perceived to be their natural characteristics, indigenous Mexican bodies are understood to belong picking berries as opposed to having other jobs. On the other hand, mestizo Mexicans and white Americans are understood to have bodies that don't fit well in the picker category and belong in other positions. How much more time do we have?
5-10 minutes.
Okay.
5 to 10 minutes. Or less if you want.
Okay. At the same time that symbolic violence involves the normalization of the social and health position of other groups, this theory also includes a subtle sense of internalization of hierarchy. One doesn't perceive only others, but also oneself as belonging in ordained social locations. During my second day picking strawberries, a tractor with long metal extensions spraying something in the air drove through the field while we picked. I asked one of the farm supervisors what it was, and he said, "Do you really want to know? Are you sure you want the truth?" And I answered yes. And he explained dangerous insecticides as he shook his head. The supervisor went on to explain that the white patches on the strawberry leaves are largely due to pesticide residue. I later noticed danger signs posted in English on several large canisters surrounding the hand washing and toilet stations at the entrance to the field. Strawberry pickers worked every day without gloves as the visible pesticide residues dissolved in the mixture of strawberry juice that stained our hands dark maroon for the rest of the day. If they ate anything, they ate it in the fields while picking, often without washing their hands in order to save time and make the minimum weight. The same week as the spraying described above, I received a video I'd ordered from the United Farm Workers about the health risks of pesticides, and several of the tricky pickers watched it with me in one of our farm labor camp shacks. Afterward, like after other movies I watch with people, I asked them what they thought about it. One of them told me matter-of-factly, "Pesticides affect only white Americans, gabachos, because your bodies are delicate and weak." And in some ways, as the person who worked on the farm who was never able to pick the minimum weight, I proved to them that that was true. Another confirmed, "We tricky people are strong and we hold out." The verb in Spanish is aguantamos. And the others nodded. In this way, in a sense, tricky people have a sense of pride in who they are that's necessary in the midst of a violent history of discrimination and land dispossession in Mexico and the United States. At the same time, this sense of pride may, in a sense, simultaneously justify or internalize their position in the labor hierarchy. In some ways, these conceptions of honor at having strong, tough bodies might aid in making the destructive impact of social inequalities less visible. At the same time, it is important to highlight that Abelino and Crescencio continued to demand care and response from the medical system. As I write about further in the book, they also participate in collective action demanding healthier and better working conditions on the farm. However, in certain ways, the indigenous Mexican migrant body is pushed to betray itself, specifically because of perceptions of ethnic body difference. The migrant is seen as belonging in its position in the very agricultural labor hierarchy that then leads to its deterioration. The structural violence inherent to segregated labor in farming is so effectively erased precisely because its disappearance takes place at the level of the body and is thus understood to be natural. So in conclusion, attention to what's hidden within our food systems reveals a segregation of laboring bodies related to ethnicity and citizenship hierarchies that in turn produce correlated injury and sickness. Such inequalities are effectively naturalized through symbolic violence that's enacted by perceived ethnic body differences, including perhaps different conceptions of pride. In addition, migrant health professionals tend not to see the labor hierarchy nor its production of sickness through their clinical gaze. Instead, they often blame patients for their suffering and recommend interventions inadvertently complicit with the social inequalities. The structural nature of this hierarchy is then illuminated by the fact that even idealistic and ethical farmers and medical doctors operate within a gray zone that neutralizes and sometimes even reverses their efforts at moral or ethical action. So if we as social scientists interested in migration and food and labor and health are to orient our work toward contemporary problems and the potential for positive social change, I argue we must denaturalize social inequalities, uncovering linkages between structural violence, symbolic violence, and slow death. In this way, the lenses through which we perceive the world, as well as the social and political structures they reinforce, can be transformed. In addition, the academic project of denaturalizing social and health inequities can inform pragmatic activist and policy efforts at many levels, from including the social determination of health in medical education, what some of us in different parts of the world are starting to call structural competence as opposed to cultural competence, or buying the products of farms that treat workers fairly, to lobbying politicians to change unrealistic and violent immigration policies, and finally to activist and policy work for a more equitable global market such that people might be free to but are not forced to leave their homes to migrate in the first place. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm talking from I hope everybody listens, can hear me. So now we are going to take the questions from the audience, especially online. If you have questions, just ask them, actually. Si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas non plus. Je peux les traduire.
Can you tell if some of the medical students are on too? Mostly sociology.
Est-ce qu'il y a des étudiants en médecine notamment? N'hésitez pas à vous signaler, ça intéresse Seth Holmes. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Moi j'ai des questions. Hein.
J'ai une question, oui.
Oh, there is?
Oh, j'ai pas vu. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a? Il y a une question écrite? Non.
Ouais.
Alors.
Can you
I can read it.
can you show me how to look at chat on here? Okay.
I don't know, but I read the question.
Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. How difficult is it nowadays to cross the border in California from Mexico to the US?
Oh, it's much more difficult in the last many years. So the border between the US and Mexico, much like borders in Europe, have become more technologized and militarized. And even, for example, the amount of money that at the time when I crossed, we paid something like $2,500 to the border crossing guide if we crossed, and now the fee is something like $5,000. So it's become much harder to cross and more expensive and more deadly. So in the last 10 years, probably, there's been more immigration leaving the United States than entering, which in many ways is similar in Europe. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? Dans la salle, peut-être?
Do you want me to come to the...
Comme tu veux.
I could talk about, oh, what?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, come.
Comme tu veux.
I think you have to, oh, go ahead.
The microphone is here, so
Okay,
yes.
so thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. Your work participates in unveiling, uncovering the linkages or denaturalizing the links between social inequalities and health.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you had opportunities to present it to the farm executive and even to the farm field workers.
Yeah.
And how did they react? Did it change anything? Did it have an impact on them?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, so I have presented the work to the farm owners, many of the farm workers, some farm worker unions, and the doctors and nurses who are actually in the book, and then other groups of doctors and nurses. So the farm executives, in certain ways, hadn't been super aware or had been becoming aware that there were different kinds of Mexican workers on the farm. I think in the United States, oftentimes, and you can see this in examples of how, for example, former President Trump spoke about people, all Latinx people, whether they're US citizens and have been in the country for generations, even maybe they're Hispanos from New Mexico whose families have always been there, but the US conquered the region. They're called Mexican. And then mestizo Mexican, and I don't know how aware, I think Europeans are not as aware often of mestizaje and indigeneity. So a lot of Latin Americans, for example, Mexicans, what most people, Europeans and people from the United States mean when they say Mexican is a person of mixed descent who's a mixture, for example, in Mexico, of Spanish people and indigenous people who had children and had, generations. So those are mestizo Mexicans, but that's what people generally mean when they say Mexican. Indigenous people are native people who speak their own language that was there for hundreds of years before Spanish ever came. It's not a dialect of Spanish. That's a complete misunderstanding of linguistics and history. But so when I'm talking about indigenous people, I mean the native people. So the farm owners had been becoming aware that on their farm there were US citizen Latinos and Latinas from Texas. There were mestizo Mexicans from all over Mexico, and there were indigenous people, and that they speak different languages, and they have different cultures, and they have different class backgrounds. And so in some ways, the farm owners were interested to kind of learn and think about, okay, how do we respond? How can we be supportive? They did implement some changes, sort of in some ways more simple things, but they changed the way the driveways worked because they sort of, many times the farm owners would ask me advice about what do you think we should do, and then my response was usually, let me translate for you, let's go and ask people. And then some of the things they were told were things like, all the driveways through the farm labor camps are dusty all the time, and we're all breathing all this dust, and all our kids are breathing this dust, and we don't want that. So they did some simple things like putting gravel. Actually, the year my book in English came out, some of the farm workers organized into a union, and they used the book to argue that the conditions they were working against had been existing for some years, and that they needed a union. They didn't just need change right now, they needed long-term change. And they've been pretty impressive and successful. So they've even taken a lawsuit about, so in the US, farm workers can either be paid per hour and then they have to be paid minimum wage, or they're paid per pound. And then they still have to be paid minimum wage technically, but they often are not because the records aren't watched super closely. And like I explained at the time when we were picking, almost always we wouldn't take lunch breaks or bathroom, like toilet breaks, because then you risk not making the minimum weight, which is based on the minimum wage, and then you lose your job. But if you're paid per hour, you're required to get half-hour lunch break and 15-minute bathroom break every couple hours. So this union sued the state of Washington, the entire state, saying this doesn't make sense. The labor law says people get bathroom breaks. Therefore, the bathroom time and the lunch time should not be counted against the how much weight they pick. And they won. So now everyone who's paid per pound still gets a half-hour lunch break. You know, some things like that that don't change the whole system and hierarchy, but do make things somewhat better and shift a little bit of power. Some of the doctors were not happy. I think they had, even though I had explained I'm doing a research project about ethnic interactions and labor and health, and I'm writing about all of these things, I think we, as a doctor, we are used to being the experts who are interviewed, and what we say is the fact that's written down. It's not analyzed. And so I think even though I had explained it and they, you know, signed consent forms, I think when I then analyzed what they said and argued that part of what they're saying is based on the way that medical education leaves things out, a couple of them were upset and were like, why are you doing this? So we talked about it a fair amount, and I actually worked hard to be careful that their identities were really super confidential so their colleagues couldn't figure out who had said what. Other doctors, including doctors who worked in that clinic, said this is right on and this is really important and this is what I see happening, and I'm glad you're helping us kind of put words to it. So those are some of the responses. I think I could say a little bit about what I've been working on since then, if that... unless, yeah. I can't see the chat, so I can't tell.
En fait, je n'arrive pas à voir de vue panoptique de la discussion. Mais... Anan, tu as une question?
Ouais, j'ai une question.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I prepare a question about the life expectancy. Because you've shown that the social hierarchy is materialized in different ways, from basic accommodation to medical assistance or non-assistance. Did you compare the life expectancy of these workers, indigenous workers, to other parts of the population, American population, to see how there are this difference are embodied in life expectancy?
Yeah, great question, and in some ways an especially timely question. So for the last at least 5 years, life expectancy overall in the United States has been going down. And the public health researchers are arguing that that's due to increasing social inequalities. So the poor, for example, in the big cities like San Francisco, near where I live, if a person is homeless, their life expectancy is 30 to 40 years old. If the person matched with age and gender otherwise is housed, their life expectancy is 70 to 80 years old, so half as long. But even the public health researchers are arguing that even the wealthy people in the United States, as social inequalities are growing, anxiety among the wealthy people is growing. They're hiring guards to protect their property. They're putting in cameras and barbed wire fences to protect their bicycles. They're living behind gated communities, etc. That's decreasing their lifespan also. In this case, the migrant farm workers, there isn't very much research that's specific to indigenous migrant farm workers, because in all our data collection in the United States, indigenous people are understood to be indigenous to the US, and Mexicans and Venezuelans and Cubans and Argentinians, whether they're poor or rich, are all considered Hispanic. And so this group of people, I don't actually, like, if I look at the data, I don't know where they are. I don't know whether and it depends on who asks. If a white person writes down who they are, they'll probably write that they're Hispanic. But if they're asked who they are, they might write that they're indigenous. But then that puts them in the category of Native American, and so it's hard to know. But there are some people who've looked at migrant farm workers overall, and their life expectancy is, I believe it was 40s to 50s, so much lower than the average in the country. And the few quantitative researchers who are doing research with indigenous migrants have shown that their living conditions and working conditions and access to healthcare is all worse. But no one has done statistical work on their life expectancy. And I don't know. On the other hand, so I'm not sure.
Okay,
but that's
thank
a good
you.
question. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Merci pour la question. Before you were intending to talk about your next research, but
I could.
I'll have a question about this one.
Sure, go for
if
it.
you don't mind.
Yep.
Because, well, of course, I liked many things about the study you presented. One thing I liked among others was the fact that the social hierarchies between different ethnic groups in Mexico are maintained in the farm in the US.
Yeah.
And so tricky Indians have the lowest position both in Mexico and in the plantation.
Yeah.
And it reminds us and it reminds the students here how deep and strong are the social hierarchies. And you show very well that this hierarchy reproduces itself through the bodies of migrants.
Mm-hmm.
The trickies are the shortest workers. They are the ones who are the most able to endure the pains of the hardest and most dangerous tasks. So they are, they say they are closer to the ground,
Mm-hmm.
That they are more resistant.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm wondering is to which degree these naturalizations work at the level of the individual,
Mm-hmm.
and to which degree it works at the level of the category tricky, you know,
Yeah.
or even at the level of the hierarchical system itself.
Yeah.
For example, do they think trickies in general are closer to the ground and endure better pain, or do they think that they, as individuals, having their own bodies, you know, endure pain better and notice that most trickies also endure it?
Mm-hmm.
From their point of view, and from the other point of views too. For example, do the doctors sometimes think with the tricky category,
Mm-hmm.
or not? But you already answered it a little, or see them only as individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my question is about how the ethnic hierarchy reproduces itself in different contexts.
Yeah.
In which extent is directly through the categories or through thoughts that involve only the individuals.
Yeah. That, I think that could be a research project in and of itself that would be pretty interesting, actually. So there are moments, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is, and I don't remember in which book it was, but I remember Pierre Bourdieu wrote, being is being perceived, or that's the English translation, such that there is no way to be, there's no way to experience being a human actor, a subject, a social actor, without knowing that you're being perceived within through categories as the social actor you are. So in some ways, they're always informing each other, the individual level and the category. What I mostly heard was categorical speech, both by the tricky people and by the doctors and nurses. There were times when individual level analysis came in, but the times that I can think of were when the farm did not want responsibility for pesticide related sicknesses, for example. Well, that individual, that person is more susceptible, was the answer. Whereas when it came to why are we stronger or tougher, or why should they be working in those fields, it always was, but that's partially because the discussion was a categorical discussion, we or they. I don't remember tricky people saying, I don't experience that. I remember them saying more, we don't. But that also, in some ways, could relate to the fact that I was the one white guy working on the field. So then, in some ways, they may be explaining their category to me as opposed to them as individuals. But I think many times people were thinking with the category.
But for example, in other ethnic groups like
Mestizo,
for example, yes.
Yeah.
Do some, perhaps a few individuals among them think they are also closer to the ground and also stronger, etc. I don't know.
Yeah. I think the racialization, the categorization and the differentiation was a really strong, just very strong in the air. I mean, that's kind of what was happening. Was it hadn't been that many years that indigenous people had been coming to the US for, I don't know, 1960s through 1990s. It was mostly mestizo people from northern Mexico had been coming, and mostly only men. And then it was more recent that families came, and more recent that indigenous people came. And I think a lot of people were and are thinking with those categories a lot, those racialized ethnic categories about who are these indigenous people, why are they coming, why are they faster than the other people, and instead of analyzing it through economics or through a history of colonization, like they have been taught to work this way, or they live in really difficult conditions, and therefore this job is more like a survival necessity to them. The analysis was always this mix of biology, culture, this kind of assumption of culture and this assumption of biology or genetics. And that's what was most interesting to me as a medical doctor who's also a social anthropologist, how both these categories became really important, but then were always understood, especially in the clinic, through biology and behavior, or genetics and behavior, and not anything else, not economics, not history, not citizenship status or immigration status. And then, but even on the farm, it was similar. So does that make sense? I don't know if I fully answered your question, but.
Well, yes, you did what you there's one more question. On commence par la question en ligne. Donc nous vous écoutons, allez-y.
Elle est écrite.
Ah pardon, excusez-moi. Je vais la lire là. Donc c'est Julie Timon qui demande bonjour, j'ai une question. Quelle place ont les enfants de ces travailleurs? What is the role, the place of these workers' children? Do they do the same job than their parents, or they're sent to school?
Good question. Both. The answer is both, and it's sort of a complicated answer and a good question. So the kids, when they're very young, I have pictures in other places where the 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 7-year-olds are in the field with their parents in California because there isn't childcare for them. That's kind of the only option for their parents to get to work, is to take their kids with them. In Washington State at the time, there was a state-funded childcare program for farm workers, so the kids did not come to work, the little kids. But then once the children were youth, once they were maybe 12 or 13, many of them would come to work and start working and picking whenever school was not in session. So in Washington State, because in the US in certain ways is sort of like the EU, you have to remember that California is only a tiny bit smaller than France, and California's economy is roughly equivalent to the economy of France, so our states are large. In Washington State, the law is that migrant farm workers can work 6 days a week. They have to have 1 day off. No. In Washington State, they work every day. In California, they work 6 days a week. So in Washington State, the kids would go to school Monday through Friday, and then they would work with their parents on the weekend and over spring break or any holidays. In California, it's similar, but they tend to work on Saturdays and holidays, and they work in the summer. So one of my, I don't know how to, maybe this one. Go. So a project that I'm working on now, which actually, I should have given you a new website, but I'm working with the children of the farm workers now to understand what this next generation will do and who they understand themselves to be. They're told that they're Latinx or Latinos by white people or Hispanic. They're told they're Mexican by people from the US. They're told they're Indian by their parents. They're told that they're Triqui by other people, and kind of how does all that come together for them? Who do they understand themselves to be? They work in farm work on weekends and during spring break, but then they're going to school. What do they want to do in the future? And the children of the families are starting, are in high school. Some of them are starting, a couple are starting community college. So this is happening now. And one group, 4 cousins and I, for 4 years in a row, drove from Washington State to Oaxaca. Those 4 cousins were born in the US, and they were the first generation of people born in the US from the Triqui families. So they have a Mexican passport and a US passport. They're the first generation that can cross back and forth without going through the more dangerous routes. And they wanted to meet their granddad because he had gotten sick in their home village, and they had never met him and they'd never been there. So the first year we went, which was 5 years ago, I think, we went down for Christmas and New Year's. We drove down and they met their relatives, and we filmed it. And now it's called First Time Home, and there's a website that's firsttimehomefilm.com. And we just put up the trailer, and we hope that this kind of visual ethnography will be up next year. But that's something I'm following, kind of who will they be in the future? What do they want to do? And right now it's sort of unclear. So that's a great question.
Je crois qu'il n'y a plus de questions de la salle, en ligne, mais n'hésitez pas. Et sinon, il y a une question de la salle. Vous pouvez peut-être la poser directement au micro ici, au micro de l'ordinateur.
Thanks for a nice paper. Can you expand or come back a little bit to the kind of conclusion you came up with about structural competence?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you're creating awareness, and you said it's kind of a mixed reception between rejection by some of the physicians and quite welcoming feeling on the other side.
Yeah.
Does that basically take you back to occupational health in a certain sense, or are you going somewhere else with that? Where's the difference?
Good question. So there's So in the United States and Canada, all health professions and especially medical school are competency based. And every medical student is required to become proficient in certain competencies in order to move to the next year. And most of the competencies are very biomedical and clinical. But one competency in the Americas, and from what I've seen in Europe since the 1980s, has been cultural competence. And one of the primary ways that social inequalities and health inequalities has been dealt with has been through cultural competence. And some versions of cultural competence, I think, are very helpful and well-meaning. Some can be very aggressively and helpfully critiqued. In a book that's called Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, written by Jonathan Metzl, who's a psychiatrist and sociologist at Vanderbilt University. He follows the history of the diagnosis of schizophrenia and the history of one particular hospital and the patients in that hospital, to argue that the diagnosis of schizophrenia itself changed from having adjectives in it that subtly encouraged the diagnosis to be used with upper-class white women, and then adjectives that changed within the very diagnostic manual that, especially during the Black rights, civil rights movement, that encouraged it to be diagnosed of Black men who were resisting white supremacy. And it's an interesting book. And in the conclusion, he says something, just kind of an offhand comment about maybe what we need in medicine is not cultural competency. It's to understand these structures within medicine and these structures within society. Maybe we need structural competency. And I remember when I read that book thinking that is a good idea. Like, that's a way to bring the analysis of history and society and inequalities and social categories, etc., to a medical audience in a way that makes sense. So one group of us in California called the Structural Competency Working Group, and then one kind of network nationally and internationally has started working on how do we teach some of these analyses, historical, social, to medical practitioners. And in California, we developed a curriculum for medical students that I sent to you this morning, teaching what we're calling structural competency. And in many ways, the reception primarily has been very positive and very, the first time we taught it, the reception was, this is really important. We see this in our work. It's important for us to have this language to talk about it. And it's overwhelming because we don't know what to do about it. Like, how are we supposed to change, colonial history and racism and everything? And then we expanded the last part of the training to have more examples of community groups and medical groups that have worked at the intersection of social inequalities and health, so that the people going through the curriculum also have historical and contemporary examples to think with about what people have done, both as individuals just interacting differently with patients and as groups lobbying or doing advocacy to change things. There are some people at the same time, some medical students who come from immigrant backgrounds and poorer backgrounds who have said things like, we already know this. My family knows this because we've experienced this our whole lives. So we are also trying to be, as a group of, most of us who are in this group are medical doctors and anthropologists, sociologists, historians, actually. And we come from many different backgrounds, ethnically, etc., but we all are MD, PhDs with faculty positions. So we're trying to make sure that the training is as aware of the diversity of people who are learning as it can be as well. So Yeah, that's an ongoing thing. There's a group of people in Europe who are kind of seeing what structural competency means in Europe, because part of what it means in the US is pushing for universal health insurance, which is a different thing. So some of the cases we use or examples we use don't match as well in Europe, but many of the things that we've developed make sense in either context.
Who are the groups in Europe who are working with that?
Well, it's partially there's a person, Margaret Jaeger, she's a social anthropologist who teaches in the medical school at Sigmund Freud University in Vienna. And then there's a social anthropologist who teaches at a medical school in Budapest. But there's a network of people who I gave the email to Camille and Alice. Yeah. And there's someone in that group who's actually taking a position at the medical school in Cairo too, and thinking about how do we teach these things in the Egyptian context.
Occupational health?
Oh, so how different is it?
Or does it go back to that to a certain degree?
In my research, it's more related, for sure. But like in the work of Jonathan Metzl, where he's working on schizophrenia, not so much. But in terms of, what occupational health has been meant to be, where it's taking on the material conditions that lead to the health problems and not just giving Tylenol or ibuprofen, but also changing the material conditions and working conditions. I think that is a super helpful way to do things. In the US occupational medicine, I don't know the exact ratio, but I would guess 90% of occupational medicine doctors work for the corporation that employs the laborer, and maybe only 10% work for the state or the federal government or the city. And so in the United States, occupational medicine, it depends on whether you're talking about its ideal state or its real functioning. And I imagine in Europe it's somewhat different because you have, more of your clinics are state run. But not different, yeah, okay. So then I think part of the question is, do you mean idealized occupational health or do you mean actual occupational health? Yeah, and I'm actually very strongly considering retraining in occupational medicine because for the last years, I've been volunteering in urgent care, 1.5 day a week, roughly, because I like still doing some clinical work as I'm primarily doing social analysis, and the opportunity for thinking about social issues through occupational medicine is really strong. But when I've gone to conferences in occupational medicine, I've been impressed by how many of the people there are corporate physicians. Yeah.
Il y a une question de Camille.
You.
I mean, this Camille or another one?
This Camille.
I don't know if it's a question or maybe a remark. I don't know how it will come. Something that was very interesting to me in your paper was when you speak about being out of place.
Yeah.
When you work in the field, and I thought that it might be a very interesting way because it helps you understand how those people are suffering. Working in the field, bent over, like you did. And I thought about how conceivable is it to have farm executive work for a day or something like that in the field.
Yeah.
As you can see that, for example, in short food circuits, food system circuits in France, for example, we have that the consumer goes back to the field to work with the field workers.
Yeah.
and experience also the kind of work that they have to endure. So this was my first question, remark question. And the other one, and maybe it could also be conceivable for physicians to go into the fields and to and to see how it is to work and to try to gather like 50 pounds of
How big
is that?
A big bucket is 13 pounds.
Wow.
So yeah, every hour. Yeah, it's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So that was my first remark, and the other one is, do you happen to know the work of Annie Thébault-Monny, a French sociologist who developed a very, very interesting scientific project. She's working with medical doctors, and she's working with industry workers who suffer from cancer. With it's an occupational cancer, but they had different temporary jobs, so it's very difficult to.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so she's working in collaboration with those physicians who. And with social scientists who try to reconstruct the curriculum of those workers to see how they were exposed to different products and to different pesticides or to different toxic chemicals, and to help identify the source of the sickness, and to help identify the fact that it's an occupational disease and not not a behavioral or biological disease. Maybe
interesting. Could you email me her name or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a very interesting work.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting works, collaborations between social sciences and medicine.
Yeah, interesting. I have been interested in the cancers that come from pesticide exposure, and how even there were a few interviews where the farm executives would speak about, well, yes, this person has that issue, but they've only worked on our farm this summer, and last summer they worked on a different farm, and last summer they worked on a different farm, so why should we have to pay for their health coverage? And on some level they're right, but on another level the person needs health coverage, so we need a different system. But that the temporality and responsibility and structural level of racism all kind of get conflated into disinvestment and no one taking responsibility. So that's interesting. The other question, so this particular farm, part of the reason I wanted to work on this farm is that the farm executives were thoughtful people who were trying to run a good farm. And before I even started, they had, I don't think everyone, but many of the upper level farm management, they had them pick one day every year. And I don't know how long they'd been doing that, but they had the sense that that was important for everyone to not be too far away from the work. There were other farms where the owner lived in Texas and they had a manager here and the conditions were completely horrible. And I didn't really want to study that because I was afraid it would be too these people are bad and these people are good and that's all I'm writing. Part of the reason I wanted to work on this farm was that it told it's more nuanced and a little bit harder to figure out exactly what's going on and why. And this family being Japanese American, so they lost something like 3,000 acres of their land during the Japanese internment. And so even that history, they'll talk about, they've experienced racialization and they've experienced discrimination in ways. So then they have a maybe more nuanced way of making sense of the ethnic hierarchy now than someone else might. So this site allowed for more analysis of what was going on, I thought. But I love the I like the idea of doctors. Actually, maybe I'll send you another article, but of doctors being exposed to where their patients live and work. I remember one pediatrician who was wonderful, who took care of a prematurely born tricky baby. The mom was picking up until the day she started having her contractions and went immediately to the hospital because they had to survive and there aren't social systems in the US set up otherwise. And the pediatrician, the day that they were, after maybe 2 weeks of being in the hospital, they were releasing the mom and the still premature baby home. And I was with the family at the time. And the doctor said, make sure that the nursery, which means the baby's room in your house, that the temperature is always between, 17 and 23 degrees Celsius and blah, blah, blah. And the mom, smiled and said, thank you. And then we started walking away. And I felt like my way of doing ethnography was to watch what was going to happen as much as I could, and then to ask questions afterwards and not interfere in the moment. So I wanted to see what would happen. And what happened was that people were walking away. And then afterwards I went to the doctor and said, I just wanted to check with you, they live in a labor camp shack where there's no heating and no insulation and no thermostat, and there's no baby nursery that's separate. It's like there's one room. So I don't, just so I'm not sure that's possible. And he said, that I hadn't even thought of that. I think he was just imagining everyone lives in some version of house like he does. And so then the parents walked back and we talked, and they and I invited him to come over sometime and see where they live, and I would translate. So he came on Saturday or something and saw where they lived. And for him, I think it kind of blew his mind. Holy cow, people who live in my town live this completely different way, like 1 kilometer or 3 kilometers away from where I live. And he got in touch with the hospital and got some funding to get some kind of special furnace thing with a thermostat that would help heat the house so that the baby would be warmer. And he got some kind of free blanket or something like that. It doesn't change the social hierarchy and all the things that go into it, but it did open how he saw the people he was working with. And so I think something like that could be powerful. At the same time, when I was doing my research and seeing how really difficult the working conditions of these people were, I grew up in Washington State, not super far from there. I mean, not there, but not super far. And I had friends who grew up more in that region, who grew up as white kids working some in the summer picking strawberries, but they were not on the Mexican picking teams, and they were treated very differently. Like they picked as much as, and they were kids, so they didn't have to get paid minimum wage. So they picked as much as they picked, and they got paid as much as they paid, and it was kind of fun, and they kind of played around, and it was kind of hard. But so when I was doing my research and noticing, wow, this is really intense work, some of my friends were saying, I did that as a kid, it's not that big a deal. So my worry is that if the farm managers go out and pick one day, they're not going to be treated like the workers are. And if the doctors go out and pick, I've picked at the, there are farms where you, the consumer, can go pick your own strawberries. That's completely different. That's like fun and pretty, and it's like going for a hike, It's not having someone, tell you you're going to be fired and kicked out of your home if you don't pick an incredible amount. It's not feeling like you can't use the toilet for 10 hours because otherwise you might get fired. It's very different. So my worry is that if we assume that our experience of something is the same as someone else, then it might actually make it worse. We might be like, why are you complaining? I've done that. And so we have to be careful of that. There's a great article. I think it's really helpful. I've taught it to medical students. It takes a little bit of explaining for medical students, but Michelle Rivkin-Fish is a social anthropologist at UNC Chapel Hill, and she worked with dental students when they would go to do a free clinic in a migrant camp in North Carolina. And the dental faculty were taking the students to help the students both gain some experience but also have more awareness of social inequalities. But what Michelle Rivkin-Fish found was, without some explicit training and discussion about social inequalities and history and racialization and social structures, the dental students came away with more of an individualizing, neoliberal, blaming understanding of the people, because they learned as dental students that it was okay for them to practice things they didn't really have enough training to do on Mexican people, but it's not okay to do that with white people. At the main hospital or the main dental clinic, you have to have done 100 of these under supervision before you can do it yourself. But when you volunteer with the Mexicans, you can do it. It's fine. They learned this differential value of racialized life. And so her article, when I've taught it to medical students, they can be a little defensive. Well, why is she saying we're bad? But she's not. She's saying, look, if what you're trained in all day is this version of individualization and racialization that relates to neoliberal capitalism, etc., then that's what you're going to think with. And unless you're being asked to think about the social structures and social analysis, you're not going to. You're going to end up blaming that person for not being the same as the people who you've been taught other things about. So anyway, those are my thoughts about that. I'm super excited that you all here have interesting sociologists thinking deeply about things, and that you have this social science institute in the medical school. I think it's rare. There are places that have both of those, and you have a history of amazing social theorists and historians and thinkers who've been at this university. So I think those of you who are sociology students and those of you who are medical students studying social science, I know you're in a weird year with the pandemic, and I'm giving a lecture over Zoom and it's annoying, but also this is an exciting place to be, and I hope you take advantage of it and feel like, wow, I get to study at this place where there are all these resources that are like building on each other, and where I can take advantage of a lot of interesting thinking going on.
Merci.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing me here.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
Didn't you want to talk about?
I did, actually. So the two main projects I've been working on are this. Oops.
Sorry, there's a question.
Oh, another one. Yeah. So weird. I mean, you actually helped me go through the rest of my slides when you asked questions.
Anne-Karimi, Anna, je lis en anglais ta question. She wrote, do you know Shadia Arab? A-R-A-B, Shadia Arab. She's a geographer. She works on the same scientific area, Moroccan workers who migrate temporarily in Spain in order to work on strawberry picking.
Mm-hmm. How do you spell the first name?
Shadia, C-H-A-D-I-A.
Okay.
And Arab.
Yeah.
An Arab.
Okay.
Her focus is on gender and migration. She shows few months ago how it's difficult to maintain their daily income during the COVID because of the lockdown.
Yeah.
The crisis increased the precarious and invisible works. Do you have news about the workers you met during your research?
Yeah.
How the COVID crisis impact them in terms of health and work conditions?
Yeah. Really good. So thank you for the suggestion of, I'll look up Shadia Arab and Yeah, in terms of news of the workers, they're in very precarious conditions. So they have continued to work because from very early in the COVID crisis, agricultural workers in the United States have been characterized as essential workers, which means their work can't be shut down. At the same time, they have not been given personal protective equipment like masks, and they are still put in buses and vans to go to the farm every day. So a lot of farm workers I know have gotten COVID. None of the Tricky family, including many of the Tricky families, people have had COVID. None of the people I wrote about in the book have died, but many farm workers I know have died. I volunteered the month of June. I don't remember. May or June, I volunteered with Médecins Sans Frontières in Florida with Haitian and Guatemalan farm workers. And I think it's the second time in history that Médecins Sans Frontières has come into the United States. And it's because they went to, I think, the Navajo Nation and Florida to work with farm workers because the state, not entirely the state, the governmental structure in those places was not taking care of those people. And there were, like in Florida, the state government, the state of Florida government was sending resources for testing and quarantining. But all the state funding then goes through the county government. And the county government, the county where I volunteered, the county government seems to be more racist than the state government. I know this is going to be on YouTube, but and most of the resources for testing and quarantining were going to the wealthy mostly white towns on the coast. So they were renting hotels for relatively wealthy people to quarantine if they got COVID or were exposed. Whereas the mostly Haitian and Guatemalan workers in the internal of Florida who are harvesting oranges and tomatoes, which is one of like the main economic forces in Florida, had no access to isolate themselves. They live in, maybe 12 or 15 people in a one-bedroom mobile home. And so Médecins Sans Frontières came and Partners in Health came and I tested many people who were positive, and I met many people whose family members were in the hospital or had died. 3 of the Tricky families who I work with, who I have kept in touch with, and over the years I've kept in touch with, I don't know how many, maybe 7 of the families. And 3 of them during COVID were evicted from their housing, even though there's a law in the United States that evictions are illegal during COVID. But they, as undocumented people for whom English is not the primary language and who are poor, were evicted and they reached out to lawyers and tried to get help and nothing helped. And one of those families found somewhere to live after 2 weeks of living in their cars. One family, it took a month of living in their cars while the kids are trying to go to school online, which is impossible. So I know maybe two Tricky youth who are in first year of university, and they both dropped out. It was impossible for them to do online education. One of them had been evicted and there was no way to keep up, and the other one, all of his siblings are on online education. They have very bad internet connection. They don't have a computer. They just have kind of like, I don't know what they're called, kind of like an iPad, but not. and they share them with their siblings, and they're all trying to do school at the same time. So it's been hard. Yeah. I don't know if that's... So the projects I'm mostly working on are working with the youth, and I think I showed the... Oh, gosh. I don't know how to go back, but I showed the picture of the film that we're working on and that project, and then I've been working on this more kind of oriented towards medical education project, and then I have a smaller project that I'm not so active in right now with pandemic, etc., where I've worked with some German anthropologists or anthropologists in Germany, not all of whom are German, with Syrian refugees. And then actually, not last summer, but the summer of 2019, I spent the summer in Syria, working with a university there and a medical school, the Rojava Academy of Medicine, and was thinking about, and am still thinking about, doing a project between Syrian families in Syria and the refugees in Europe, and how they stay in touch and care for each other across distance, and how they think about who they are, and how all of that affects their bodies and health too. So.
Well, there are no more questions on the internet, in the room neither. Perhaps you want to add something or to talk about your next projects, or anything as you wish. It's okay, or we can stop now.
I don't know what time it is.
It's quarter to
Quarter
noon.
to. I think if there are no questions, I'm okay with... I don't know how to make it... I only had one other slide that I didn't show, and it was from the work in Syria. But
Is it the next one?
yeah.
Well, wait, excuse me. You have to go there, I think.
Yeah, to the middle one maybe.
Yes.
Okay,
and then
okay.
it should go.
Aha, yeah. So my current projects are this... Now it's called First Time Home, but building on that, kind of just following this second generation of Tricky people and who they will be and what work they'll do. So this was on our... We had driven down all the way to their home, their parents' home village, and this is a picture from that. And as I said, the film, I think last week we put the trailer on the website, and we're submitting it to film festivals now. Actually, one of the best visual anthropology, visual ethnography film festivals in the world is French, the Jean Roche, yeah. And so we'll submit to that. We'll see, maybe we'll come back. We've been invited actually to show it at, there's a visual ethnography center in Marseille that's related to the CNRS, the La Fabrique, that we'll probably show it in the fall. And then there's the structural competency work. Now I'm writing a book in Marseille that I'm calling Training for Unequal Care, where I'm analyzing what medical education people would call the hidden curriculum of medicine, where you have the official curriculum that you're learning, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and then there are these hidden things you learn about whether or not homeless, and you learn it partially through the cases that you're taught, but partially through seeing how doctors and nurses interact with patients. And you learn a little bit whether or not homeless people deserve the same level of care, whether or not immigrants deserve the same level of care, when race should be mentioned in a case or not, and how you should think about that, what race is or not isn't, what genetics relate to, how social inequalities relate to genetics or to history. So that I'm thinking through all those things that we learn in medicine that are not officially taught, but are taught. And mostly it's been a really enjoyable and complicated process, because a lot of the field notes and data that I'm analyzing are my own from my medical training. there are also interviews with other people and transcriptions, but it's a different kind of social science that I'm not as used to doing, but it's also interesting. And then this is a picture of in Rojava at the University of Rojava in Kamislo 2 summers ago when I went there, and I met with the people at the Academy of Medicine there, and it was kind of fascinating.
Which country?
It's Syria, North Syria. The part that declared autonomy in 2016, maybe. Partially Kurdish, partially Arabic, partially Assyrian, and other groups. And the way that they teach medicine was fascinating because I think the fact that they're in the middle of a war that's kind of paused but kind of still a little bit ongoing, they're trying to train medical doctors more quickly so that they can have more doctors, and they're trying to train nurses more quickly they've used the curriculum, like they've looked at medical education curricula from the Americas, from Europe, and from the Middle East, and they have a curriculum committee at the medical school that looks at the curricula and tries to take out the hidden forms of racism and capitalism and sexism that are in it, and then teach a version that doesn't have those pieces. So for me, it was really interesting to hear how what they're trying to do differently there. But I haven't been able to go back because of bombing and pandemic. So we'll see. One project that was kind of fascinating, which one direction I think my research has been heading, is more sort of collaborative research and even collaborative writing. So the last article I wrote related to Syrian refugees in Europe, I co-authored with anthropologists in Germany and with Syrian refugees. So we were writing about one event that took place in Berlin, and we interviewed the Syrian refugees, about 3 or 4, about what their experience of that event was. And then those of us who are anthropologists wrote a rough draft of the article, and then we met together and discussed it over coffee and tape recorded the discussion, sent them a version. They hand wrote responses. We did a revision based on that. We met for coffee again, recorded it. They hand wrote responses, and then it was kind of a fascinating way to hear how they also are analyzing the social categories, and how at some points social science can seem obfuscating, or some of our language can seem unnecessary, and then thinking through, okay, which of these terms are necessary and helpful, and which can we get rid of and talk about a different way. And that the film, the visual ethnography, the 4 Tricky youth cousins are directing it, which also has been interesting to see how they want to portray themselves and their families for the audience, and to see who they want the audience to be and who they imagine the audience to be. So that's been fascinating too. And I will be in Marseille until July, trying to finish as much as I can of the Training for Unequal Care book about medical training. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Merci beaucoup. So I think you have nothing to add. Je crois qu'on peut clore la conférence. J'ai oublié, merci Alice de me l'avoir rappelé, de remercier profondément la MICHA, c'est-à-dire la Maison interuniversitaire des sciences de l'homme d'Alsace, qui nous a accueillis, qui nous a fourni le matériel vidéo. Seth Holmes a accepté que la vidéo soit retransmise sur YouTube. Donc là, en ce moment, c'est filmé, c'est enregistré, et ce sera sur YouTube. Voilà. Donc, pour le regarder à nouveau, si jamais vous connaissez des gens qui ont raté la conférence et qui veulent la voir, ce sera sur le site de la Micha, accessible par le site de la Micha. Si vous avez un doute, vous m'envoyez évidemment un mail. Voilà. Et merci à toutes et tous d'avoir assisté à la conférence. Merci encore à Seth Holmes. Et je vous souhaite un bon appétit, j'ai envie de dire, puisqu'il est midi. Au revoir.
Merci. Thank you.